The ration card trembled in Dieter Weiss's fingers as he waited in line, the cold wind cutting across the Norfolk cliffs like a blade. The guard at the gate barked something in English he didn't catch, and the men ahead of him shuffled forward, their boots scraping against gravel still wet from the morning rain. The air smelled of salt and coal smoke, the strange perfume of defeat. Behind the barbed wire, a Red Cross truck rattled to a halt, its sides painted white but streaked with mud. British workers in worn coats began unloading crates stamped "Relief Supply." Weiss's stomach clenched at the sight of them, at the faint scent of flour rising through the air. "Bitte, Brot," he murmured, barely audible. The guard turned, misheard him as begging in English, and jerked a thumb toward a long hut marked Cultural Acclamation. Weiss stepped inside, blinking at the haze of steam and frying oil. The smell was heavy, foreign, vinegar, salt, something like burning linen. Two British cooks stood behind a counter, sleeves rolled up, tossing golden fillets into a vat that hissed like the sea itself. One of them, a tall man with a narrow face, smiled without looking up. "First day, eh?" "Don't worry, mate. We'll make you proper English yet." He scooped a paper parcel from the counter and held it out. Weiss took it carefully. The warmth surprised him. So did the weight. He expected bread, dense, dark rye, the kind that cracked when cut. Instead, he found pieces of battered fish and pale strips of something that looked like roots. "Brat?" he asked again quietly. The cook chuckled, misunderstanding again. "Bread?" "Oh, no. Better than that. Fish and chips." Weiss stared at the meal. Oil dripped through the paper and onto his sleeve. Around him, other prisoners bit hesitantly, their eyes darting to one another for guidance. Some chewed slowly, unsure if this was kindness or test. The taste hit him in waves, grease, salt, vinegar biting at his tongue. It filled his mouth, but not his hunger. The laughter of the British workers echoed against the wooden walls. Not cruel, but careless, like the sound of people who had never known true famine. Weiss forced a smile, though confusion pressed against his chest. "Good?" one of the cooks asked. He nodded once. "Good," he said, his accent stretching the word until it cracked. When the meal was done, he stepped outside, the paper wrapping crumpled in his fist. The sea wind tore at it until the oil-stained sheet fluttered away down the yard. Behind him, the men filed out silently, each carrying the same dull look, the polite gratitude of the defeated. Weiss sat on a stone near the fence, watching gulls circle the cliffs. The smell of vinegar lingered in his hands no matter how hard he rubbed them against his coat. He thought of the kitchen aboard U-boat 382, the steady rhythm of knives, the hiss of boiling broth, the way bread had meant order amid chaos. Now, even food felt foreign, unanchored from meaning. A guard approached, his boots crunching on gravel. "Everything all right then, Fritz?" Weiss looked up, startled by the tone, half jest, half weariness. He hesitated, then said, "Ja. Good food." The guard nodded, satisfied, and walked off whistling. Weiss watched him go, his breath turning white in the air. In that small exchange, something inside him shifted. The realization that gratitude might be mistaken for surrender, silence for peace. That night, in the dim light of the barracks lamp, he opened the small notebook he kept hidden beneath his mattress. The pages smelled faintly of sea salt and ink. His hand shook as he wrote, not from cold, but from something harder to name, the ache of being seen, yet not understood. "The enemy has fed me better than my homeland," he wrote, "yet I do not recognize what I eat." He paused, staring at the line until the words blurred. Then he added one final thought, pressing the pencil down until the point broke. "Sometimes kindness tastes like defeat." The smell of vinegar hit Lieutenant Commander Harold Fenwick before the sound of laughter. He stepped through the mess hall doorway and stopped, boots sinking slightly into a sticky patch of spilled oil. Steam rose from tin trays lined with pale fries and golden fish, curling through the cold March air that seeped in from the open windows. Across the long tables sat rows of German prisoners, thin, silent men eating as if afraid to offend the food itself. The British cooks leaned against the counter, whispering jokes between mouthfuls of their own lunch. Fenwick's eyes moved from the uneaten crusts on the floor to the listless faces at the tables. Something was off. He had come unannounced to prepare for the War Office inspection, expecting to find order, not this uneasy carnival. His clipboard knocked lightly against his leg as he strode down the aisle. The Germans straightened automatically, their tin forks poised mid-air. A few nodded in nervous respect. Others simply watched him with the distant gaze of men long accustomed to authority's scrutiny. "Sergeant Miles," Fenwick called. His voice was firm, naval-trained, cutting through the low murmur. The stocky sergeant hurried forward, his uniform dusted with flour. "Sir?" "What in blazes is this?" Fenwick gestured to the meal. "Who authorized fried fish and potatoes for prisoners?" "I expected bread and stew rations." Miles scratched his neck, glancing toward the cooks, then back. "Cultural goodwill, sir." "Thought it might show a bit of hospitality. Keeps the Red Cross happy, you know." Fenwick frowned. "They asked for bread, didn't they?" "Yes, sir, but, well, chips are our bread, aren't they?" Miles laughed weakly, realizing too late that his superior wasn't amused. Fenwick walked to one of the tables. A prisoner, broad-shouldered despite his thinness, sat with his hands clasped, the meal untouched. Fenwick recognized the insignia of a naval cook on the man's faded jacket. "You there," he said gently. "Why aren't you eating?" The German hesitated, searching for words. "We ask for bread," he said haltingly. "Bread. They give fish." Fenwick nodded slowly, understanding the root of the confusion. "You expected bread," he murmured, half to himself. "Not this." The prisoner nodded once, lowering his eyes. Fenwick felt an unexpected pang, something between guilt and pity. He thanked the man and turned back toward the kitchen where the cooks had fallen silent. Later that afternoon, Fenwick gathered the guards in the yard. "Listen carefully," he said, pacing before them. "Tomorrow's inspection will focus on morale and nutrition. The War Office wants proof of humane treatment. You'll maintain order and civility. No jokes, no improvisation. And, for heaven's sake, find some proper bread." The men nodded, but he sensed their indifference. To them, these prisoners were yesterday's enemy, men whose submarines had sunk British ships, whose bombs had fallen on English soil. Offering them fish and chips felt, perhaps subconsciously, like ironic justice. That evening, as the sun bled red over the cliffs, Fenwick lingered near the kitchen. Through the half-closed door he heard laughter again. Two cooks stood by the fryer, sleeves rolled up, joking between crackles of hot oil. "Did you see their faces?" "Like they'd never seen real food before," one said. The other chuckled. "They don't even know what a proper meal is, poor devils. Give 'em chips and they stare at it like it's gold." Fenwick's grip tightened on the doorframe. For a long moment he said nothing. The laughter echoed, hollow and careless. When he finally stepped away, he wrote in his notebook under the dim bulb of his office, "Humanitarian effort or mockery?" The next morning arrived gray and cold. The Red Cross jeep rolled through the gates, its flag fluttering weakly. Fenwick guided the inspectors through the barracks and infirmary, speaking with practiced precision. He praised the cook's initiative, the guards' discipline, the prisoners' cooperation. He avoided their eyes when he said it. At the mess hall, the Germans stood beside their neatly arranged plates, each holding the same meal, presented as proof of decency. One inspector, an older man with wire-rimmed spectacles, smiled. "Impressive work, Commander. Not many camps maintain such standards." Fenwick inclined his head. "We do what's required, sir." The Germans ate silently, the British smiled politely, and the clipboard filled with approving notes. Everything looked perfect. Yet behind the facade, Fenwick could still hear that laughter, faint as memory, rising from the kitchen like the ghost of a truth no report would mention. That night, in his quarters, he sat alone with the final paperwork. His pen hovered over the line marked Conduct of Staff. He thought of the prisoner who had whispered, "Brought." He thought of the cook's jokes, the uneasy silence of men forced to be grateful for what they didn't understand. The ministry wanted reassurance, not honesty. Fenwick closed his eyes and signed the form. The ink spread like gilt across the page. The Red Cross inspection passed flawlessly, though Fenwick's conscience did not. The easiest lies are those told to keep peace, not truth. Sergeant Otto Heller stepped into the bitter morning air with a paper slip clutched in his hand. Frost crusted the edge of the mess hall window where the queue of prisoners waited, breath clouding like smoke from an engine. Behind him, inside Hut 7, men murmured anxiously in German, arguing about what words might pierce the wall of misunderstanding between them and the English cooks. Their voices overlapped, soft, careful, defeated. "Say brought, but slowly," one suggested. "They think it means beg," another warned. Heller said nothing. He had volunteered because he could speak a little English from his school days. Now he rehearsed each word under his breath, tasting them as if they were fragile. "Bread. Please. Just bread." When his turn came, he lifted his chin, straightened his back, and saluted the corporal behind the counter. The man's face was red from the stove's heat. Grease shone on his sleeves. "Bread, please, just bread," Heller said carefully, his accent stiff but clear. The cook smirked, spat a seed from his teeth, and turned to the fryer. "Oh, you mean chips, mate? That's our bread here." He tossed a scoop of potatoes into the oil. The hiss swallowed Heller's reply. In a minute, a parcel of steaming fish and chips landed on the counter. "There you go, friend." Proper British loaf. The men behind Heller chuckled uneasily, not sure if they should laugh or look away. Heller froze. He didn't feel mocked exactly, only misplaced, like a man applauding at the wrong part of a song. He nodded stiffly, murmured, "Danke," and carried the parcel outside. The smell of vinegar and salt clung to his sleeves. Back in Hut 7, 6 pairs of hollow eyes watched him enter. "Well?" asked Weiss from his bunk, his notebook resting open on his knee. Heller unwrapped the parcel. "The same," he said quietly. "Fish and potatoes again." A sigh rippled through the hut. The youngest among them, Private Kroll, muttered that perhaps the British found it amusing to feed sailors from a U-boat nothing but fish. Heller silenced him with a glance. "They don't mean harm," he said, though his voice faltered. "They simply don't understand." He divided the food carefully, tearing the fried fillets into strips, the batter crackling like brittle paper. Each man took a portion as if handling something sacred. "Pretend it's bread," Weiss said dryly, crumbling his share between his fingers. "Close your eyes." The warmth filled the room for a moment, but so did the quiet ache of memory, the crust of home, the smell of rye baked dark and dense, the sound of knives on wooden boards instead of tin plates. That night, as rain struck the tin roofs, Heller sat near the stove, his hands extended to the faint heat. "Tomorrow I'll try again," he said, maybe with another word. Weiss looked up from his writing. "Do you think they'll ever understand what we mean?" Heller thought of the cook's grin, of the hiss of oil. "Perhaps they already do," he said, "and that's what frightens me." Weeks passed before anyone from outside noticed. A Red Cross translator, Captain Eldon Frey, visited the camp to review reports. His accent was clipped, his uniform pressed clean, but his eyes softened when he spoke to the prisoners. Weiss, encouraged by Heller, explained their request, the bread, the confusion, the laughter. Frey nodded slowly, taking notes in his ledger. "I see. You prefer darker loaves. Cultural preference." Heller opened his mouth to correct him, but the officer was already closing the book. "Noted. I'll file it properly." When he left, the men felt a flicker of relief. At last, someone had listened. Yet in London, when the report reached the Red Cross office, the clerk read the entry and marked it under culinary preference, not distress. The paper joined dozens of others in a neat gray folder labeled Non-Critical Observations. Back at Brighton, the kitchen fires burned on. The cooks still called out cheerfully, "Fish up!" chips hot, as if generosity itself could heal a war. Heller stopped asking. He ate in silence, tasting the oil, the salt, the small humiliation baked into every bite. Weiss wrote again that evening, his pencil trembling over the page. We are learning their kindness one misunderstanding at a time. Outside, gulls wheeled over the cliffs, their cries sharp against the wind. The sea smelled of home, but spoke another language. And inside Hut 7, the men chewed slowly, eyes distant, as if each mouthful carried them further from what they remembered. Even good food can taste bitter when the world refuses to understand you. The teleprinter rattled like distant gunfire inside the London decoding office. Ensign Victor Lorne leaned forward, eyes half-lidded with fatigue, as another line of type punched across the yellow paper roll. The air in the small basement room smelled of damp wool and machine oil. Cigarette smoke hung low, trapped by the lack of windows. Most days his job was mechanical: translate, transcribe, report. But today, a peculiar line flickered through the static. German POWs expressed confusion regarding English rations, requesting black bread substitute. He blinked, uncertain if it was a joke. For months, he had decrypted messages about troop movements, submarine losses, coded threats, and now peace had reduced him to this: a bread request. He tore the strip from the printer and held it up to the lamplight. The words looked harmless, almost comical, yet something about their tone made him pause. The formality of express confusion sounded like surrender disguised as etiquette. Bread, he muttered under his breath, the word rolling oddly in his mouth. From torpedoes to toast. Across the room, his colleague, Petty Officer Crane, noticed his smirk. "What's the joke, Vic? Another letter from your sweetheart?" Victor shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Better. The Germans are complaining about lunch." Laughter erupted from the few remaining clerks, echoing off the metal filing cabinets. Even the ceiling fan seemed to hum in amusement. To them, the war's ghosts had become trivia, newsprint, nostalgia, or, in this case, a punchline. Yet Victor couldn't fully laugh. The way the message had been worded, it wasn't complaint, but confusion. It reminded him of the intercepted German pleas he'd once translated during the war. Sailors trapped in U-boats asking for mercy from the sea. At lunch, he carried the note folded neatly in his breast pocket, its edges softening with the warmth of his uniform. The canteen was crowded, officers seated in tidy rows beneath posters proclaiming, "For King, for Country, for Compassion." The irony was lost on no one. Commander Huxley sat at the head table, a large man with a red face and the weary satisfaction of someone who had survived by outlasting everyone else. Victor slid into a seat beside him and placed the message on the table. "Came through from Norfolk this morning, sir. POWs asking for black bread. Seems the cooks have been giving them fish and chips instead." Huxley glanced at the paper, eyes narrowing as he swallowed a mouthful of cold beans. "Fish and chips? Can't say I blame them for being confused. The stuff barely qualifies as food. Should we forward it to the Red Cross liaison? It might reflect poorly if the Germans think we're mocking them." Huxley waved a dismissive hand. "Mocking? My boy, they're prisoners, not guests at the Savoy. Let them taste a bit of British hospitality, our version of it. That's how you teach civility. And besides," he added with a short chuckle, "it'll make good press when the reports say even German POWs enjoy British cooking." Victor stared at him, caught between disbelief and obedience. "You want me to let the message through?" Of course. But adjust the tone. Make it sound grateful. Wouldn't do to have the public thinking we've been cruel to men who tried to sink our ships, would it? The laughter at the table rose again, light and careless. Victor forced a smile, but the sound of it lodged like grit in his throat. He knew what propaganda could do. He'd translated its echoes for years. It didn't need to lie outright. It only needed to choose what truth to keep. That night, back in the decoding room, he rewrote the message as instructed. German POWs at Camp Britan express appreciation for generous English rations and humane treatment. He hesitated before pressing send. For a moment, the silence of the room pressed down on him, heavy as guilt. Then the machine clattered to life, spitting the words into the telegraph line, words that would soon be read not as confusion, but as gratitude. A week later, posters appeared across London's newspapers. Even German prisoners praise Britain's kindness. The public applauded. Women in queues nodded approvingly. The Ministry of Information declared it proof that Britain had fed its enemies with dignity. The same sentence Victor had written under quiet duress was now a headline carved into national pride. He stared at one of the posters tacked to the office wall, the paper curling at the edges. "We made them say it," he murmured. "We made them thankful." Meanwhile, miles away in Norfolk, Corporal Dieter Weiss was writing his own words in a thin notebook. The fish and chips had grown colder by the day, the taste now a symbol of something deeper, kindness that didn't belong to him. He watched British workers laugh over shared cigarettes and wondered whether mercy could feel like mockery when served in the wrong form. When Lieutenant Commander Fenwick returned for inspection, the camp seemed quieter. The laughter had dulled into ritual. Weiss approached him discreetly after roll call, the notebook trembling in his hands. "Sir," he said in broken English, "I write about the food, about the, how you say, meaning." Fenwick's eyes softened. "Meaning?" Weiss nodded. "They give food, yes, but it feels like lesson." He handed over the notebook. Its pages were worn, stained with grease and sea salt, each line written with deliberate care. Fenwick read the entries in silence. "They feed us with smiles, but forget we have our own hunger." His throat tightened. He glanced toward the watchtower where the Union Jack fluttered against the pale sky, its brightness indifferent. "Do you wish me to send this to the Red Cross?" Fenwick asked gently. Weiss shook his head. "No. I wish someone to read it honestly." Fenwick closed the notebook, the weight of it heavier than expected. He slipped it into his coat pocket, knowing he would have to decide soon, truth or obedience. Later that evening, as he wrote his inspection summary, he paused at the final line. "Prisoners well fed and cooperative." His pen hovered. He thought of Weiss's eyes, calm yet hollow, and of Lorne's doctored message echoing through London's headlines. When he signed his name, his hand trembled. He folded the report neatly, sealing it with wax, then turned toward the window. Beyond the fence, gulls drifted over the cliffs, their cries sharp against the wind. The camp lights flickered, pale imitations of warmth. Fenwick whispered to no one, "Maybe mercy shouldn't need witnesses." But he knew that wasn't how empires worked. They needed applause to justify compassion. And so the lie remained, printed, praised, and permanent. When compassion becomes performance, truth drowns in applause. The guard's boots scraped against the gravel as he locked the post crate with a rusted latch. Weiss watched the motion carefully, metal grinding on metal, the dull clank echoing in the still spring air. His fingers lingered on the folded letter he had just handed over, its paper already smudged by his thumbprints. "It will reach Hamburg, yes?" he asked quietly in halting English. The guard, a stout corporal named Grant, gave a curt nod without meeting his eyes. "Red Cross mailbag goes out tonight. Don't worry yourself, mate." His tone was distracted, already moving to the next task, but to Weiss, those words were a fragile lifeline. For the first time in months, he had written to his wife, not to confess despair, but to describe the strange mercy of captivity. "They feed us well, but they don't see us," he had written. "We are ghosts learning to chew new air." He stood outside the post hut long after Grant walked away. The camp smelled of wet earth and boiled potatoes, the evening sun spilling through barbed wire shadows that striped the yard. Around him, other men were laughing faintly over a soccer game made with rags and string, their joy thin as mist. Weiss's gaze drifted toward the sea beyond the cliffs. Somewhere across that gray horizon, his letter would travel, if the world still remembered how to listen. Days passed, then weeks. Every morning, Weiss waited near the mess line, watching for the post wagon. When mail arrived, the guards shouted names: Bauer, Kreutz, Lehman, but never his. He told himself it was distance, delay, the rubble of post-war Europe slowing every path home. Yet each silence cut deeper than hunger ever had. One evening, he approached Sergeant Miles outside the administration office. "Please," Weiss said, holding up his ration card like a token of proof. "My letter, sent weeks ago." To Hamburg, Miles, lighting a cigarette, exhaled without looking at him. "Mail's handled by intelligence before it leaves port. Could take months, could be lost. You're lucky to be going home at all, lad." His voice carried no malice, only weariness, but it sank like a stone in Weiss's chest. Unbeknownst to him, far from the camp's wind-bitten cliffs, the letter had already reached a different kind of desk, a narrow office in London, where ink stains spread like bruises on official paper. The clerk who opened it wore thick spectacles and the detached calm of a man who no longer heard meaning in words. He skimmed the sentences aloud. "They feed us well, but they don't see us. Oil and salt fill our meals." His pen stopped on the words oil and salt. He frowned. "Naval terms," he muttered, possibly coded reference to fuel or coordinates. Within hours, the letter was forwarded to a section marked Signals and Intelligence, Maritime Division. The officer who received it, Major Quentin Rowe, had spent years breaking enemy ciphers. To him, every innocent phrase could conceal a map. "He served aboard a U-boat, didn't he?" Rowe said, reading Weiss's record. "We can't risk anything leaking." "File under interception, potential code." He stamped the page, withheld pending review, and placed it in a locked drawer. Back at Camp Britan, Weiss waited under a sky that refused to change. Spring winds softened, but his hope hardened into silence. Each night he traced invisible letters on the wooden bunk, his wife's name, his child's face, the words he could not send again. He began to fear the letter had offended someone, or worse, vanished. The men around him spoke of freedom ships bound for Europe, of wives who might no longer wait, of streets where their names were erased. Weiss nodded but said nothing. His war had ended, yet his words were still prisoners. Lieutenant Commander Harold Fenwick returned to the camp in late April for an unannounced inspection. He found the men quieter than before, their eyes older. When he entered the administrative hut, Sergeant Miles rose and saluted with awkward haste. "Everything's in order, sir. The repatriation list's ready." Fenwick glanced over the paperwork but paused at a file labeled Interception, P.O.W. Correspondence. "What's this?" he asked. Miles hesitated. "Routine check, sir. A few letters flagged by intelligence. One of them mentioned oil and salt, triggered the filter. They think it's coded." Fenwick's brow furrowed. "Oil and salt?" He took the file and began reading Weiss's letter. The handwriting was neat, the tone weary but human. There was no code, only a man's confusion wrapped in civility. He looked up sharply. "This isn't a cipher," he said. "It's grief." Miles looked uneasy. "Orders, sir." Intelligence Bureau said, "Policy before sentiment." Their words, not mine. Fenwick closed the file slowly. "And what happens to the man who wrote this?" "He's on the next transfer list, sir. Northern Camp. They didn't give a reason." That night, Fenwick walked alone along the coastal fence. The sea below churned in pale foam, the wind heavy with the smell of salt and diesel from passing trawlers. He thought of the line in the letter, "We are ghosts learning to chew new air." It was not rebellion, it was recognition. He lit his pipe, the flame trembling in the breeze. For the first time in months he felt ashamed of the uniform's silence. In London, Major Rowe filed the intercepted letter away, satisfied that no danger remained. To him, it was just another document, another precaution. But in Brighton, the silence it created grew into something larger. Weiss was summoned at dawn 2 days later. "You're being transferred," a guard said. "Orders from above." Weiss packed in silence. His notebook, his ration card, and one stub of a pencil. His entire world in a bundle. As he climbed onto the truck, he glanced back at the hut where he had written his letter. The window was open, the wind flicking at a loose sheet of paper on the desk inside. It looked almost alive, struggling to escape the weight of silence. Fenwick arrived just as the truck rumbled toward the gate. He raised a hand as if to stop it, but lowered it again. The decision had already been made elsewhere, sealed in a drawer labeled "Security." The horizon glowed faintly pink with dawn, yet the camp felt gray as ever. He stood by the coast until the sound of the engine faded into the wind. Beyond the cliffs, small fishing boats dotted the sea, their lanterns flickering like restless souls. "Men free, men fed, men unseen," he murmured, the phrase echoing against the rocks. The next morning, when clerks reviewed the office drawer, they found the letter still there, unposted, unopened, and marked classified. And so, Corporal Dieter Weiss left Camp Brighton without ever knowing why silence had followed his words across the sea. The truth had drowned beneath good intentions and bureaucracy, swallowed by the same nation that believed it was being kind. Sometimes mercy is censored before it's even read. The train screeched to a halt beneath a gray sky heavy with salt and smoke. Dieter Weiss stepped down onto the cracked platform of Hamburg Central Station, the air sharp with coal dust and the faint sour scent of rot from the harbor. He carried no luggage, only a folded paper from the British War Office granting his release and a Red Cross parcel tucked under his arm. Around him, men in patched uniforms searched the ruins of their city for faces they might still know. A gust of wind scattered ash across the tracks, blurring the border between the living and what had been lost. He found his street half collapsed, the bakery where his wife once worked now a shell of brick. When she appeared in the doorway of a surviving tenement, her face was thinner, her hands trembling around a chipped mug. "Dieter," she whispered, as if testing whether the name would still answer. He nodded, unable to speak. They embraced awkwardly, two people bound more by memory than certainty. Inside, the walls were damp, a single lamp casting a weak glow over the table. From a drawer, she drew a small parcel wrapped in tin and brown paper. "It came months ago," she said softly. "From England. I didn't open it." Weiss set it down carefully. The parcel was cold, its paper stained with oil. He peeled it open, and the scent of old vinegar and stale grease rose into the room. Fish and chips, preserved by intention, forgotten by time. He stared at it, speechless. His wife watched him, mistaking the silence for gratitude. "They must have cared," she said, "to send food even now." Weiss wanted to agree, to let her believe in kindness unbroken by war, but all he saw was confusion, a ghost of misunderstanding still haunting him. "It is kind," he murmured, though his voice cracked. Later, on the harbor pier, he sat alone with the parcel beside him. The water below was thick with debris, black with oil. Gulls screamed overhead, tearing at the waves like arguments left unresolved. Weiss unwrapped the fish again and broke off a piece. It crumbled between his fingers, soft and foreign. He tasted it, cold, metallic, and sour, and felt something collapse inside him. He was home, yet still adrift. The war had ended, but the language of mercy was still mistranslated. He thought of Lieutenant Commander Fenwick, the British officer who once inspected their camp. The man's face had carried an unease Weiss had not understood then. Somewhere, perhaps in a clean London office, that man was writing his final report, shaping words that would decide what the world remembered. Weiss imagined him pausing over a sentence, crossing out phrases like mockery and replacing them with goodwill. A war could end on paper more easily than it could in hearts. Meanwhile, in London, Fenwick indeed sat before his desk, the late sun glancing off the Thames outside his window. His resignation letter lay unsigned. The envelope before him was marked Britan Diary. Inside were Weiss's confiscated notes, the ones he'd meant to destroy but couldn't. He read the line again, underlined in pencil. I have learned that hunger is not always for food. It struck him harder now than any reprimand. He slipped the letter inside, sealed the envelope, and left it on the corner of his desk before walking out for the last time. Back on the pier, Weiss dropped the last of the fish into the sea. The gulls swooped and vanished into fog, their cries dissolving into the wind. Around him, the city's cranes groaned like weary soldiers. He closed his eyes and listened, not to the silence of defeat, but to the restless murmur of survival. Somewhere between two nations, between guilt and grace, something human still persisted, nameless yet unbroken. When nations stop fighting, the misunderstandings keep speaking. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights compassion, irony, and the unexpected humanity that can appear even in times of war. Its purpose is to provoke thought, inspire empathy, and remind us that kindness can bridge divides, even between former enemies.